Imagine living in a world where someone could legally own you, not hire you, not employ you, own you. Imagine knowing that if you tried to escape, they could hunt you like an animal, capture you, beat you, and sell your children. Now imagine escaping, finding freedom, and then making the impossible decision to go back. Not once, not twice, but over and over and over again, knowing every trip could be your last. Tonight, this is the unbelievable true story of Harriet Tubman, the woman who refused to leave anyone behind. There are people who change history, and then there are the rare few who become history. Some people spend their entire lives trying to stay alive. Others risk everything, so complete strangers might have the chance to live free. Tonight's story is about one of the most bravest women America has ever known. A woman who could not read, who had almost no formal education, who lived with a permanent brain injury, who suffered seizures for the rest of her life, and yet became the most feared woman in the United States. There was a price on her head. Slave owners wanted her captured. Some wanted her dead. Yet somehow, time after time, she slipped through the darkness, leading frightened families toward freedom. She never carried an army. She never held political office. She never became wealthy. But she changed thousands of lives simply because she refused to leave anyone behind. Tonight, I will tell you the incredible true story of Harriet Tubman, a woman history almost lost, but the world never forgot. Hi everyone, my name is Lucy and welcome back to Over 60, Disabled and Alone. If you enjoy inspiring true stories, historical documentaries, and remarkable people who proved that age, disability, or impossible circumstances don't have to define your future, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and join our wonderful community. Now, make yourself comfortable because tonight we're stepping back into one of the darkest chapters in American history to meet one of its brightest lights. Chapter 1. Before she became Harriet Tubman. Before she became famous, before newspapers called her a legend, before slave owners called her the Moses of her people, she was simply a little girl named Araminta Ross. Most people today know her as Harriet Tubman, but Harriet wasn't the name she was born with. She entered the world around 1822 on a plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Back then, birth certificates for enslaved children were almost never recorded. Nobody bothered writing down the birthdays of people they considered property. Her parents, Ben Ross and Harriet Ritt Green, were both enslaved. Like millions of others, they had no freedom, no legal rights, and no control over their own families. Imagine being born already owned by someone else. Imagine knowing that someone could sell your mother, your father, or your brothers and sisters at any moment, and there would be nothing you could do to stop it. That was the world Araminta entered. She wasn't called Harriet yet. Her family affectionately called her Minty. It was a sweet nickname for a child whose life would be anything but sweet. She grew up surrounded by forest, marshes, rivers, and farmland, beautiful landscapes that hid unspeakable cruelty. From the time she could barely walk, Minty learned that childhood didn't exist for enslaved children. At just 5 years old, she was rented out to another household. Her job, watching a baby. If the baby cried, Minty was whipped. If the baby woke up, Minty was whipped. If she became tired or hungry or fell asleep herself, she was whipped again. She later recalled being beaten until blood ran down her back. She carried those scars for the rest of her life. Many children would have broken. Minty didn't. Even then, there was something different about her. She hated seeing suffering. She hated injustice, and she possessed a stubborn courage that no beating could erase. It was only the beginning. The worst was still to come. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2. The blow that changed everything. Sometimes history changes in a single moment, not with a declaration or a battle or a famous speech. Sometimes history changes because of one terrible accident. For Harriet Tubman, that moment came when she was only 12 years old. No one could have imagined that one violent blow to her head would leave her disabled for the rest of her life, and somehow also help shape the woman she would become. One afternoon, Minty had been sent to a nearby general store. The small building was crowded. Farmers came and went. Children carried supplies. Enslaved workers wait quietly for instructions. Then, without warning, everything changed. An enslaved young man, terrified and desperate, made a run for the door. His overseer chased after him. "Stop him," the overseer shouted as Minty stood near the doorway. The overseer ordered her to block the young man's escape, but Minty refused. She would not help capture another human being. The frightened young man pushed past her, still running towards freedom. Enraged, the overseer grabbed the nearest object he could find, a heavy metal weight used for measuring goods. With all his strength, he hurled it towards the fleeing young man. He missed, and instead, the weight struck Minty directly in the head. The impact was devastating. She collapsed instantly. Blood poured from her scalp. Those around her thought she might die. There was no ambulance, no emergency room, no trauma surgeon, no brain scans. She was simply carried home, where she laid unconscious for days. Some believed she would never wake up, but she did. The little girl survived, yet she was never the same. From that day forward, Harriet Tubman carried the effects of that injury for the rest of her life. She suffered blinding headaches. She experienced sudden dizzy spells. Without warning, she would fall into deep sleep, sometimes in the middle of a conversation, sometimes while walking, sometimes while working. Doctors today believe she likely suffered a traumatic brain injury, possibly resulting in epilepsy or narcolepsy. She also experienced vivid dreams, powerful visions, and moments she believed were messages from God. Some people dismissed them, others feared them, but Harriet embraced them. She believed God had spared her life for a reason. Years later, Harriet would say that during these episodes, she saw remarkable visions. Sometimes she believed God was showing her danger. Sometimes she believed he was showing her which path to take. Whether people believed her or not, one thing became impossible to ignore. Time after time, those instincts saved lives. During her rescue missions, she often changed directions unexpectedly. She would stop an entire group, turn around, and take another route through the woods. Only later would they learn that slave catchers had been waiting on the original path. Coincidence? Faith? Instinct? History cannot answer that question, but people she rescued never forgot. Many people today assume disability ends a person's purpose. Harriet Tubman's life tells a very different story. She lived with chronic pain. She lived with neurological problems. She lived with episodes she could neither predict nor control. Yet she refused to let those challenges define her. Instead, they strengthened something far greater, her faith. As Harriet grew older, she became deeply spiritual. She prayed constantly. She believed God walked beside her. When fear threatened to overwhelm her, she prayed. When danger surrounded her, she prayed. When impossible decisions stood before her, she prayed. Faith became her compass, not because life was easy, but because it wasn't. Imagine living every day knowing you could collapse without warning, knowing your head could suddenly pound with unbearable pain, knowing people thought you were strange or broken or weak. Most people would have accepted a quiet life. Most would have stayed hidden. But Harriet Tubman wasn't most people. Her disability didn't stop her. It prepared her. Every hardship, every scar, every sleepless night, every painful memory was shaping the woman history would soon remember as one of the bravest Americans who ever lived. She had survived slavery. She had survived a life-threatening injury. She had survived unimaginable suffering. Now something inside her began whispering that surviving was no longer enough. It was time to become free. In our next chapter, Harriet Tubman will make the most dangerous decision of her life. She won't just escape slavery herself. She'll do something almost unimaginable. She'll go back again and again and again, risking everything to rescue others. And before long, slave owners across the South will know her by a name that fills them with fear: the most wanted woman in America. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3, The Most Wanted Woman in America. There comes a moment when every person must decide whether fear or faith will guide the rest of their life. For Harriet Tubman, that moment came in 1849. She was about 27 years old. Her owner had died. Rumors spread across the plantation that enslaved people might soon be sold to settle debts. Families would be torn apart, children separated from their mothers, husbands from wives, brothers from sisters. Harriet had seen it happen before. She knew exactly what it meant. If she stayed, she might never see her family again. And so she made a decision that few dared to make. She would escape. She didn't know what lay ahead. She had no map, no money, no safe place waiting for her, only determination and faith. Traveling mostly at night, she followed the North Star. She walked through dense forests, crossed icy streams, hid in swamps, and crawled through fields, always listening for dogs, horses, or the voices of slave catchers. Every sound could mean capture. Every stranger could be an informant. Every sunrise meant finding another place to hide. One mistake could cost her everything. Weeks later, Harriet crossed into Pennsylvania. She had reached free soil. She later described that moment by saying, "When I found I had crossed that line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person." And she wasn't. For the first time in her life, she belonged to herself. Most people would have stayed. Most would have started a new life, far away from danger. But Harriet Tubman did something almost unimaginable. She turned around. Freedom didn't feel like freedom if the people she loved were still enslaved. So she went back, not because anyone asked her to, not because anyone paid her, but because she couldn't bear the thought of leaving others behind. What became known as the Underground Railroad was actually not a railroad at all. There were no tracks, no locomotives, no stations. It was a secret network of courageous people, both black and white, who risked imprisonment, financial ruin, and even death to help enslaved men, women, and children escape to freedom. Safe houses were called stations. The people who guided escapees were called conductors, and Harriet Tubman became one of the greatest conductors the Underground Railroad would ever know. She planned every rescue with astonishing precision. She often traveled during the winter months when long nights provided more darkness and fewer people were outdoors. She rarely moved on Saturdays, knowing newspaper advertisement for escaped enslaved people often were not published or printed until Monday. 2 days of extra could mean the difference between freedom and capture. She learned secret songs that carried hidden messages. One hymn might mean it's safe to come, another hide immediately. To anyone else, they sounded like ordinary spiritual songs, but to those risking everything, they were lifelines. Harriet also carried something else, a small revolver, not to threaten slave catchers, but for an even harder reason. If someone in her group became frightened and wanted to turn back, they could expose everyone else's location. Harriet knew that one frightened person could doom an entire rescue mission. She reportedly told them, "You'll be free or die." It was a heartbreaking choice, but one born from the brutal reality of slavery. Turning back often meant torture, and the names of everyone involved would be forced from them. Harriet understood there was no room for hesitation. Trip after trip, she slipped through enemy territory. She rescued parents, children, brothers, sisters, friends, and complete strangers. Each journey became more dangerous than the last. Slave owners were furious. Rewards were offered. Posters described her. Words spread throughout the South. A mysterious woman was stealing what they considered their property. Stories about Harriet grew larger with every successful rescue. Some believed she possessed supernatural powers. Others claimed she could disappear into thin air. Some slave catchers refused to pursue her after dark, believing she was protected by God himself. Whether legend or truth, one fact became impossible to deny: they simply could not catch her. Over roughly a decade, Harriet Tubman made around 13 documented rescue missions. She directly guided about 70 enslaved people to freedom, including members of her own family. She also provided instructions and support that helped many dozens more escape. Every successful mission embarrassed the slaveholders. Every successful mission proved that courage could overcome fear. Years later, people began calling Harriet Tubman the Moses of her people. Just as the biblical Moses led his people out of bondage, Harriet led others out of slavery. And remarkably, history records show that she never lost a single person on any of her rescue missions. Not one. But Harriet's story was not finished. Soon, America itself would erupt into civil war. The nation would be divided, brother against brother, North against South. And Harriet Tubman would once again step into danger. Not as an escaped slave, not as a conductor, but as a scout, a spy, a nurse, and eventually the first woman in American history to lead an armed military expedition during the Civil War. The woman they couldn't catch was about to become an American legend. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4, The Legacy of an Ordinary Woman Who Became Extraordinary. Harriet Tubman had escaped slavery. She had returned again and again, risking her freedom and her life to lead others out. She had survived violence. She had survived a devastating head injury. She had lived with pain and unpredictable neurological episodes for decades, and somehow she kept going. But if you think Harriet Tubman's story ended with the Underground Railroad, it did not. In many ways, another chapter of her remarkable life was just beginning. When America went to war in 1861, the United States descended into civil war. The country was tearing itself apart over slavery, succession, and the future of the nation. And Harriet Tubman, the formerly enslaved woman slaveholders had desperately wanted to stop, went to work for the Union cause. Think about that for a moment. The country that had allowed her to be enslaved, the country whose laws had once permitted her capture, now needed people like Harriet Tubman. And Harriet answered, not because America had always protected her, because it hadn't, but because she understood what was at stake: freedom. Harriet served in the Union in several capacities. She worked as a nurse, caring for sick and wounded people. She worked as a cook and laundress. But those descriptions barely scratched the surface, because Harriet possessed something military commanders desperately needed: knowledge. She understood how to move without being detected. She knew how to gather information. She knew how to listen. She knew how to survive. And she understood that enslaved people themselves possessed invaluable knowledge about roads, rivers, Confederate movements, plantations, and the surrounding countryside. Harriet became involved in reconnaissance and intelligence work for the Union. The same skills that had once helped her guide people to freedom could now help fight the system that had enslaved them. The Combahee River Raid. Then came the night that would secure another place for Harriet Tubman in American history. June 1863, in South Carolina, the Combahee River Union forces were preparing a dangerous military operation. Harriet had helped gather intelligence about the area, including information from people who knew the land. And during the expedition, Harriet Tubman accompanied Colonel James Montgomery and Union troops aboard gunboats moving up the river. Their mission included striking Confederate resources and liberating enslaved people. Imagine the scene: darkness surrounding them, gunboats moving through hostile territory, Confederate forces nearby, and aboard those vessels was a woman who had once been considered someone's property. A woman who had been beaten as a child. A woman who once ran through the darkness herself, terrified of being caught. Now she was returning with the United States Army behind her. As the Union boats approached plantations along the river, enslaved families realized what was happening. Freedom had arrived. People began running towards the river. Men, women, children, families carrying whatever possessions they could manage. Some brought blankets, others brought food, some carried babies in their arms, others brought nothing. They simply ran. Hundreds of enslaved people escaped during the raid. Historical accounts commonly place the number at more than 700. More than 700 human beings moving towards freedom. And Harriet Tubman, who had once wondered whether she herself would ever be free, was there. Pause for a moment and imagine what that must have meant to her. The little girl who had been struck in the head was still there. The frightened young woman escaping slavery was still there. The daughter who couldn't rescue everyone she loved at once was still there. But standing beside all of them now was the woman she had become. Harriet Tubman had gone from escaping slavery to actively helping the Union destroy its foundations. When the war ended, the Civil War eventually came to an end. Slavery was abolished throughout the United States through the 13th Amendment. You might imagine that Harriet Tubman's remaining years were filled with comfort, that America showered her with money, honors, and gratitude. But history is rarely that tidy. Harriet struggled financially. Despite the dangerous work she had performed during the Civil War, she spent years seeking adequate government compensation and recognition for her service. She was not wealthy. She was not living in a mansion. She did not retire into luxury. Instead, she returned to Auburn, New York, where she had established a home, and she kept helping people because apparently Harriet Tubman didn't know when to stop. Her home became a refuge. Family members lived with her. People in need came through the doors. She helped those who were struggling, even when she had little herself. There is something extraordinary about that. Harriet knew hunger, she knew poverty, she knew homelessness and insecurity. She knew what it felt like to need somewhere safe to go. So when she finally had a home, she tried to make room for others. Her fight was not over. As Harriet grew older, another injustice demanded her attention. Women still could not vote throughout the United States. So Harriet joined the movement for women's suffrage. She appeared at gatherings and spoke in support of women's right to vote. Think about the span of this woman's life. She had been born enslaved in a country where she possessed almost no legal control over her own life. She escaped. She rescued others. She served during a war. She helped people build lives after slavery. And then, as an older woman, she was still standing up, still demanding that America become better. Harriet understood something fundamental. Freedom isn't something we achieve once and then forget it. Every generation has to protect it. Every generation has to expand it. And every generation has to ask, who is still being left behind? Growing old, but time eventually catches up with everyone, even with Harriet Tubman. The years passed, her hair turned gray, her body weakened. The effects of the head injury she suffered as a child never completely disappeared. Yet she lived into her 90s by many historical reckonings, though uncertainty about her exact birth year makes her precise age at death difficult to establish. Even late in life, she remained concerned about others. She helped establish a home in Auburn intended to care for elderly and disadvantaged Black people. Think about how beautifully that brings her story full circle. The child who had once needed protection became the woman providing it. The person who once needed rescue became the rescuer. The woman who once had been denied control over her own body spent her life fighting for other people's freedoms. In 1913, Harriet Tubman died in Auburn, New York. Pneumonia had taken hold. Her extraordinary journey was finally over. But her story wasn't. More than a century later, we're still saying her name. Children learn about her in school. Books have been written about her. Movies have told parts of her story. Museums and historical sites preserve her legacy. Generations of Americans have looked at Harriet Tubman's life and discovered something worth remembering. Courage doesn't mean you aren't afraid. Courage means fear doesn't get the final vote. What Harriet Tubman's story means to us, and this is part of Harriet Tubman's story I especially wanted to share with you, because this isn't only a story about slavery. It isn't only a story about the Civil War. It isn't only a story about something that happened more than a century ago. It's also a story about what human beings can become after life hurts them. Harriet Tubman lived with the lasting consequences of a serious injury. She experienced chronic pain and neurological symptoms. She grew older. She struggled financially. She experienced loss. She knew fear. She knew exhaustion. She knew what it meant to be underestimated. And still, her life mattered. There are people watching this right now who may feel their most important years are behind them. Maybe someone has made you feel invisible because you've gotten older. Maybe your body doesn't work the way it once did. Maybe you are living with a disability. Maybe you are alone. Maybe you're struggling financially. Maybe you've looked at your life and wondered, what could I possibly do now? Harriet Tubman's story offers an answer. Something. You can still do something. Your contribution doesn't have to make history books. You don't have to rescue hundreds of people. You don't have to become famous. Sometimes changing one person's life is enough. Sometimes that one person is yourself. Maybe courage means leaving something that's hurting you. Maybe it means asking for help. Maybe it means beginning again at 60, 70, 80, or beyond. Maybe it means finally telling your story. Maybe it means deciding I'm still here. And perhaps those 3 words are more powerful than we realize. So in closing, Harriet Tubman was not born powerful. She was not born wealthy. She wasn't born free. She didn't begin life with advantages. She began life enslaved. She was hurt. She was beaten. She suffered an injury that affected her for the rest of her life. There were countless reasons why history could have forgotten Harriet Tubman. Instead, history remembers her, not because nothing terrible happened to her, but because terrible things did happen, and they didn't get to decide who she became. She did. So if someone has ever looked at you and decided you were too old, too poor, too damaged, too disabled, too insignificant, or simply too late, remember Harriet Tubman, because an extraordinary life doesn't necessarily begin with an extraordinary person. Sometimes it begins with an ordinary human being who gets knocked down and decides to stand back up one more time. And perhaps the greatest lesson Harriet Tubman left behind isn't simply that she found freedom. It's that once she found freedom for herself, she turned around and went back for somebody else. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If Harriet Tubman's story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to Over 60 Disabled and Alone if you haven't already. And before you leave, I'd love for you to answer one question in the comments. What part of Harriet Tubman's life inspired you the most? Maybe somebody reading your answer needs to hear it today. Until next time, please take care of yourself. Please take care of one another. And remember, it's never too late for your life to matter. God bless.